to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 132, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. I don't know about where you are, but where we are here in Northwest Montana, it is very hot. We are breaking 90 degrees now for the first time this summer, and this is probably my least favorite time of the year, or one of them. I always say there's a reason I live in Montana, and it's not because I like hot weather. So summer is something to be endured. About the only bright spot is that the garden is flourishing. We had a little incident a couple of weeks ago while I was in Oregon. A deer got into the garden. It pushed down a fence, and nobody was out there to check because it was raining. It poured the entire time I was in Oregon. It poured here. So nobody went out to the garden because why would you? And the deer nibbled on all my apple trees and pulled up a bunch of my bean plants and mowed down the peas, and I just had to give up on a few things, but the tomatoes look great, the potatoes look wonderful, the squash is just taking over, and things look really good out there. My sewing time has been a bit limited, although I have been working on something that I can't talk about yet. It's kind of a secret project, but when I can talk about it, if I can talk about it, I will. I did get the Seamwork Lou raincoat cut out, and I got the lining cut out, and now it's just the process of assembling that, and I'm hoping to get started on that soon. But I'm also in charge of feeding people for a big bike event that our church is hosting the week after next. So the next 2 weeks I'm going to be knee-deep in food preparation, and the Monday after the bike tour is done, I have to get a temporary crown put on one of my molars, which is starting to bother me. So I'm looking forward to August 3rd and getting past that dental procedure, and then I should have some time to sew. Keep your fingers crossed. It doesn't look like it's going to be a bad fire season here, and we're getting periodic rain showers. So I'm hoping that August will be calm, and all I will have to do is can food and sew. That sounds like a great way to spend my August. I've recently had a couple of conversations with people who are either learning to sew or getting back into sewing after a number of years. And those conversations have led me to think that maybe it's a good time to revisit some basics when it comes to sewing. So that's what today's episode is going to be about. We're going to talk about some of the skills that you need to develop as a beginning sewist. And if you work on developing and perfecting these skills, more advanced techniques will come more easily to you. I think of this as being analogous to learning your scales when you are learning a musical instrument. I play the piano, and things like scales and arpeggios aren't sexy, but being able to do them without thinking has really served me well as a church pianist, because there are parts of my piano playing brain that I put on autopilot and don't have to think about. And sewing is very similar. So we're going to talk about getting a handle on those skills and which skills I think are important. You may have a different list, but we'll start here and see where we go. Some of this is also informed by years and years of teaching and seeing students' bad habits. And it's much easier to prevent a bad habit from starting than it is to break one that's already established. So you'll probably get some of that editorial as we go along too. And for those of you who are experienced sewists, I hope that you will continue to listen anyway, because a lot of this is good information to go over periodically. The first few items on my list really have nothing to do with actually sitting down at the sewing machine, but they are essential skills nonetheless. The first one is to choose an appropriate fabric and prepare it properly. I know that some people will argue back and forth over whether fabric should be pre-washed or not. I am firmly in the camp of pre-washing fabric when at all possible, or if it can't be washed in a machine or by hand, then having it dry cleaned. And there are some good reasons for this. It accounts for any shrinkage that might happen, because there's nothing worse than getting a pair of pants done and washing them the first time and finding that they've shrunk 2 inches. Or you've pieced a quilt and some of the fabric was washed and some of it wasn't. And when you wash the quilt for the first time, the shrinkage is uneven and your quilt becomes misshapen. A lot of fabrics also come with some kind of sizing in them. And I find that sizing really irritates my skin. So it's always better for me to wash the fabric and get that out of there. I always treat the fabric the same way that I'm going to treat the finished product. So if it's something that I intend to wash in the washing machine and dry in the dryer, I will do that with the fabric. The next skill that I think it's important to master and understand is the difference between ironing and pressing. And this is a particular pet peeve of mine. I absolutely cannot stand to see content creators post videos where they're showing a tutorial and they haven't pressed the fabric. So first, what is the difference between pressing and ironing? Ironing is where you put the iron down on the fabric and you move it around. Pressing is where you put the iron down on the fabric, then lift it up and move it to a different part of the fabric. The problem with ironing versus pressing is that ironing can distort the grain of the fabric, especially on more loosely woven fabrics. And if you distort the grain of the fabric, it's going to be very difficult to cut it out accurately. So I think it's important to get into the habit of pressing more than ironing. And we'll come back to that later, I think. It's also good to have a press cloth available on your ironing board, because there may be occasions where the fabric can't take direct heat, and having a press cloth there will protect the fabric and protect your iron. Good pressing skills will go a long way toward making your finished garments look a lot more professional. And if you're a quilter, good pressing techniques will help to preserve the dimensions of your quilt and make matching your pieces together a lot easier. Now we come to accurate measuring and cutting. And my husband is always complaining about this with employees because apparently they don't teach how to read tape measures anymore in elementary school, or fractions for that matter, and he has to do a lot of remedial training with his employees before he lets them loose with a tape measure. So whether you are working in imperial or metric, learn your basic measurements, and it's also helpful if you can convert between the two systems. And it doesn't have to be anything complicated. 6 millimeters is basically a 1/4 inch seam. 1 centimeter is a 3/8 inch seam. 1.5 centimeters is a 5/8 inch seam. Not precisely, but close enough. So if I am using a garment pattern where the seam allowance is 1 centimeter, then I know that I want to use a 3/8 inch seam, or a 1 centimeter seam if I'm comfortable working in metric. Get yourself a good ruler, and Jenny Doan is always saying, of Missouri Star, is always saying that different brains like different kinds of measuring devices. So find the ruler that you like the best. I have a lot of OmniGrid rulers, and those are the ones that I typically will gravitate toward. If you're cutting an odd measurement, something like 4 7/8, for example, by all means use blue painter's tape to mark that on your ruler so that you have a better visual aid when you're cutting. If you are cutting with scissors or shears, make sure that you have a pair that is well sharpened. And this goes for rotary cutters as well. You don't want your pieces to look like they were hacked out with a weed whacker. I know that part of the issue is that cutting is not fun or glamorous, and a lot of us want to get to the sewing, so we tend to be a bit slapdash about the preparatory steps. But again, if you take the time while you're cutting to make sure that your cutting is accurate and clean, it'll make the rest of the process so much more enjoyable. As you are cutting, make sure that you are adding in any marks that might be on the pattern, notches or pleat markings or other landmarks that you'll need. One of the tips that I heard recently, and I tried this in my serger class that I taught on Monday this past week, was to get safety pins and alphabet beads. Put an alphabet bead on a safety pin and clip it or pin it to the pattern piece so that you don't get your pattern pieces confused. I know a lot of bag makers like Anna Graham from Noodlehead and By Annie put a page at the end of their pattern that has labels on it for each pattern piece, and those labels can be cut apart and clipped to the pattern pieces to keep everything organized. Because you don't want to sew the wrong piece to another piece and then trim and grade the seams and discover that that piece shouldn't have been sewn to the other piece. When you are finally ready to sit down at the sewing machine, there are some tips and tricks that you can use to make that a more pleasant experience. And I liken this to driving a car. My husband gets a little bit frustrated because his wife doesn't really want to know how the car runs. She just wants it to run when she gets in it and turns on the ignition. And I understand his frustration, so I have tried to establish a baseline of understanding. And I recognize when things might be going sideways and I need to call him and get his further input and direction on what to do. That was especially true with my BMW 328 diesel, which he affectionately termed the Diva because it was always malfunctioning. And a sewing machine is not that much different. I know we all want to be able to just sit down and flip on the on switch and press the foot pedal and have the machine go. But having a basic understanding of how the mechanics work and what you need to do to keep your machine happy will help you have a great sewing experience. So the first thing is know how to set up your thread and your bobbin. And that means knowing whether you should have your thread on a vertical spool pin or a horizontal spool pin. You'll have it on a vertical spool pin if it's a stack wound thread. You'll have it on a horizontal spool pin if it's a cross wound thread. And we can talk about that in another podcast. If your thread is coming off the spool the wrong way, then it is going to cause a lot of problems downstream. You'll also want to wind a bobbin properly, and if you need to refer to the manual, do that. You'll want to have the correct needle in for your project. So do you need a sharp needle or do you need a ballpoint needle? What size needle do you need? What kind of needle do you need? And again, all this information is out there. I'll try to put links to other podcast episodes that have this information. But knowing what implement is going to be punching the fabric thousands upon thousands upon thousands of times is important. Take a good look at the throat plate on your machine and look at the markings that are on it. There are usually 1/4 inch, maybe even 1/8 inch, 1/4 inch, 3/8, 4/8, 5/8, 3/4, potentially up to 1 inch, depending on your machine. Those markings on the throat plate are there to help you guide the fabric. If it's too hard for you to see them, or you want a better visual, you can put painter's tape on the bed of your machine to mark a particular seam allowance. You can get a magnetic seam guide that will adhere to the bed of your machine and provide a guide for you. There are even specialty tapes like diagonal seam tape. I use that a lot when I'm making half square triangles. We're back to that accurate measuring thing. It's not only when you're cutting out the fabric, but it's also when you're sewing the seam. And if you're doing a lot of quilting, sometimes it's good to get a 1/4 inch gauge. They're a little plastic gauge that you can buy on a lot of sewing supply websites, and they allow you to check the accuracy of your 1/4 inch seam. I know I have one Singer sewing machine. It has a hand crank on it. It's an old one, and I like to take it outside on the porch sometimes and sew with it, but it doesn't make a very accurate 1/4 inch seam. And in that case, I usually put a seam guide on the bed of that machine so that I know that I'm getting an accurate seam. As quilters, I think we all like to pretend that we are calibrated and that we can eyeball a 1/4 inch seam, and that may or may not be true, but it's good to check every so often just to make sure that you're still calibrated. It's worth noting, and we're back to that car analogy here, it's worth noting that when you are sewing, you're not watching the needle. Don't look at the needle. Don't watch the needle. What you need to be watching is a couple of inches in front of the needle, because if you're watching the needle, by the time the fabric gets to the needle, you may have missed the opportunity to adjust it or move it or sew around a curve. You need to be watching the road ahead. So you need to be paying attention to what's coming up. I want to talk a little bit about feeding material into the machine. The machine doesn't need your help, and I see this a lot in my sewing classes, and I don't like to see it. And it's when someone is pushing or pulling the fabric through the machine. I know that a lot of sewing teachers will instruct students to place their left hand behind the needle and their right hand in front of the needle. And I think a lot of people interpret that to mean that they should be using the hand behind the needle to pull the fabric and the hand in front of the needle to push the fabric. That's a terrible, terrible habit. And if you have that particular habit, I would encourage you to do anything you can to break it. What happens when you push or pull the fabric through the machine is that the needle gets deflected, and it could very well end up striking the throat plate, which over time makes your throat plate look like Swiss cheese, and at worst, it could throw your machine out of time. I've got a couple of vintage machines that have throat plates where the needle hole is just jagged and chewed up, and that also contributes to things like thread breaking, because the thread is going to be catching on the edges of that needle hole. At most, I will lay my hands on the fabric just to guide it, but I will not put any additional pressure either from the back or the front on the fabric as it's going through the machine. If you have to do that to get the fabric to move through the machine, then it's probably too thick for your machine to sew. If you're having trouble with bird nesting underneath your needle or on the bottom side of your fabric, a good habit to get into is to hold the thread tails as you begin sewing. I have to do this on my Juki 1541 Industrial, or I will have all sorts of problems. So it's just something that I've gotten into the habit of doing, and you can try it and see if it makes a difference for you. After you get your machine all set up, don't immediately grab your good fabric and start sewing. You probably have some scraps left over from cutting out. So use those scraps to test your settings and double check your stitch length and your tension, and make sure that you've got the proper needle and thread for the fabric that you're using. A wise woman, not me, Z.D. Donahue, once said, "There are those who test and those who wish they had." So that is definitely a good habit to get into. Okay, when you've sewn your seam, now we have to go back to the ironing board. And before you press that seam open, or to the side if you're quilting and that's how you prefer to do it, make sure that you press that seam flat, just as it's come off of the sewing machine. And the reason to do that is because it will help to set the stitches and put them in their proper places. Once you've done that, then you can open the seam and either press it flat or to the side. And don't just press it the way that it opens up. Make sure that you are not pleating the seam and getting a little excess fabric into it. What I do is I take my fingernails and I roll the seam outward so that I'm making sure that I'm right on the edge of the seam and making it as flat as I can. You may or may not know that I was a knitting designer for a number of years, and I wrote 3 knitting books. And the first knitting book that I wrote was called the I Hate to Finish Sweaters Guide. And part of the reason that I wrote that book was because as I was learning to knit, I couldn't find any good resources on how to assemble sweaters and darn in the ends and make the inside of the sweater look as nice as the outside. And that is a particular area of concentration for me. I don't want to say area of control, but an area of concentration is making the inside of your garment look as nice as the outside of the garment. So as you're going along, and this applies to quilts too, not just garments, even though the inside of a quilt is never going to be seen, you still want to make sure that you're trimming threads and making the inside of the quilt making the seams lie flat and making the inside of the quilt look as nice as possible, because when it comes to quilting it, either by hand or machine, it's going to be a lot easier to quilt if you don't have to work around a bunch of bulky seams or waviness, and you certainly don't want threads showing through the back of your quilt top. For garment sewist, you're going to need to think about how you want to finish the seams in your garment. If you have a serger, you can do it that way. Even if you don't have a serger, you can overcast. Most sewing machines have an overcast stitch or stitches. A lot of them have an overcast foot that is used in conjunction with those stitches. And they finish the edge of the seam not quite the same way as a serger does, but they will keep it from raveling. And it's just a nice way to finish off the seam. If you don't have a machine that's capable of doing that, you can take a pair of pinking shears and you can pink the edges of your seams, and that will also help to control fraying. You can turn under a little bit of the seam allowance, so like 1/8 of an inch, and you can sew that and make it's basically hemming the seam allowance on the vertical edge of the seam allowance, and that will finish it. I've done that a lot on aprons. I did that before I had a serger. There are some advanced seam finishes, but we're talking about basic skills here, so if you don't have a serger, overcasting or pinking are probably the 2 most common seam finishes. And I can just about guarantee that after you've pinked or overcast a whole bunch of seams in your first couple of garments, you'll be looking for a serger. I want to talk to you garment sewists now about a few more techniques that you're going to run into that at first glance you may think, why bother? But you need to put these in your arsenal and you need to follow the directions when you are instructed to do these techniques. So the first one is stay stitching, and that is where you sew within the seam allowance on a single layer of fabric to keep the fabric from stretching out. And this is typically done on bias edges, so on necklines, potentially an armhole. It just depends on where you don't want the fabric to stretch out. And let's use as an example the back neck of a top, a woven top. The back neck opening is going to be slightly curved to fit around your neck. In order to stay stitched properly, you have to start at the shoulder and go to the center of the neck, and then you cut your threads and you go to the other shoulder and you sew to the center of the neck. The reason that you don't start at one shoulder and sew to the other shoulder is because those feed dogs are stretching the fabric as you sew, and you don't want them to stretch it when you're trying to keep it from being stretched. So if you sew toward the center of the neck and then sew toward the center of the neck on the other side, that will keep your neckline from stretching out. This really does make a difference. Let's say you're making a woven top with a V-neck and you don't stay stitch around the neck opening. When it comes time to sew the facing on or bind the neck opening, you may find that your neck opening has stretched and the facing no longer fits or the binding is too short. And that can contribute to gaping and other unpleasant things. So if you see stay stitching in the directions, don't skip it. Another one that newbie sewists sometimes like to skip is understitching, because they think, what is the point of understitching? Understitching has a very specific purpose. What you are doing when you are understitching is sewing the seam allowance to the facing. So if you have a neckline facing or a pocket facing, you want to sew the seam allowance to the facing on the facing side. And what that does is it will keep the facing from rolling out. I actually think that understitching is kind of magical, because all you're doing is sewing a straight line very close to the seam, and it makes that facing lie flat. You may run into a situation where you have to ease some fabric in. Sometimes you'll see this on the back shoulder is a little bit longer than the front shoulder, and you need to ease that back shoulder into the front shoulder as you're sewing that seam. And the best way to do that is to make sure that the piece that you want to ease in is against the feed dogs on the bottom side of your seam, because the feed dogs are going to actually move that fabric a little bit more quickly into the seam than the machine will move the top fabric. So it's kind of an easy way to match up two pieces of fabric that aren't quite the same length. You'll also want to get into the habit of grading and clipping your seams before you turn them. I know we all sew a seam and we're very excited. We want to turn it inside out and see how beautiful it is. But sometimes there's a little bit more work to be done before we can do that. Poor pressing will wreck a garment. Bulky seams will also wreck a garment. Elements of the garment won't lie flat, or they may puff out in unflattering ways. So if the pattern suggests or instructs you to grade the seam allowance, what that means is that you are going to be cutting down one side of the seam allowance so that it is not as deep as the other side of the seam allowance. You might be instructed to cut it down to 1/4 of an inch or perhaps even 1/8 of an inch. And if the seam is on a curve, you will probably also be instructed to notch or clip the curve. And what you're doing there is clipping out little triangle-shaped pieces of fabric. You're taking bulk out of that seam and allowing that fabric to curve without buckling the seam allowance underneath. Sometimes you need to clip into the seam allowance, and I'm thinking of perhaps a woven top with a V-neck neckline. When you sew that V-neck neckline, if it's got a facing, you're going to have to clip into the seam allowance right at that V-neck notch in order to get the facing to lie flat at that point. And another technique I want to mention here that's good to master is top stitching. Top stitching is where you sew the seam and then you go back, and from the front side of the work, you stitch a line of stitches, usually 1/8 of an inch from the seam or 1/4 of an inch from the seam. The instructions will tell you how to do that. Many times it's decorative. Sometimes it's to add strength. I'm thinking for a bag, you might be instructed to top stitch some of the seams, and that's just to add a little bit of extra oomph to those seams. If your machine has a top stitching foot or an edge stitching foot, sometimes it's called a stitch in the ditch foot if you can move your needle. It looks like a regular presser foot with a guide below the presser foot down the center, and that guide rides in the seam allowance, and you move your needle to one side or the other a couple of ticks, and then you sew your top stitching seam. You may also see it called a compensating foot. That's what it's called for my industrial machines, and the foot has a spring-loaded portion to it so that part of it can ride low and part of it can ride higher up on the double thickness of fabric that you're top stitching. Either way, you're going to be stitching from the front side or the public side of the work. And typically, top stitching is done with a slightly heavier thread. Sometimes it's done with 2 threads in the needle. And you want to lengthen your stitch length. We're not using a construction stitch here. This is a decorative stitch. So if my construction stitch on my machine is 2.5, I'll typically bump it up to maybe 3.3 or even 3.5 to do my top stitching. I think I'm going to wrap it up here. I could go on and talk about more tips and tricks and techniques and habits that beginning sewists should learn to master, but sewing is really an ongoing accumulation of knowledge. I am still learning, even having done as much sewing as I've done, and I need to save some topics for future episodes. So, as always, feedback is most welcome. I really appreciate those of you who have been sending comments and feedback via email, those of you who have left ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts, and those of you who have left comments on Spotify. I do read all of them, and I'm trying to respond to all of them, but it has been a little bit busy here over the last couple of weeks, and I may be getting a little bit behind in responding, but please know that I do read everything. You can email me at janet@janetzabo.com. You can leave a comment on the show notes page. You can use the fan mail feature. My website is at www.janetzabo.com. It has links to my Big Sky Knitting Designs website and to my blog, and I apologize that blog content has been a little thin over the last couple of weeks. But again, it's been very busy here. I will try to get out and get some pictures. The podcast website is at www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com. The podcast has an Instagram page, Straight Stitch Podcast. I hope that you are doing better than me in the sewing department. And until our next episode, I hope you have a great week and that you get to go sew something.